All right. Otherwise, stay focused on. I mean,
They're all on right now though?
no, they're on when it's ready.
Um, Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for coming to this session. Um, my name is Wei Huan Zhou, and I'm Associate Professor at the Faculty of Law and Justice, University of New South Wales in Sydney. I'm also the co-director of the China International Business and Economic Law Civil Center. It's a great pleasure to organize this session with my co-organizers, Singapore Management University School of Law and Van Belbenis. And also very pleased to have the speakers, the distinguished panel here with me. I'm not the chair today, but I do want to take the opportunity to acknowledge the support I have received from our joint organizers and also the speakers. I will hand it over now to our chair, Professor Henry Gao.
Thank you, Wei Huan. A warm welcome to everyone for joining us in this session. My name is Henry Gao. I'm a professor of law at Singapore Management University. So very pleased to chair this session today. So before we start, let me remind my fellow panelists that if you are not using PowerPoint, you can turn off the screen by clicking the close button so that people will be able to see your face better. So our panel address one of the most cutting edge issues that face the world trading system today. And we have four excellent panelists. So maybe to start, I would just give you a brief introduction to each of our excellent panelists before they speak. First, to my far right, we have a Professor Katrin Kuhlmann, who is a visiting professor of law at Georgetown University Law Center and also the faculty co-director of the Center on Inclusive Trade and Development. She's also the president and founder of the New Market Lab. And has a lot of experience of working in and also with many developing countries. And then to my immediate right, we have Professor Amarita Barry, who is Associate Professor of Law at ETAM in Mexico, and also co-chair. I'm very proud to say in my capacity as a member of the advisory board of the WTO chess program, she's also the co-chair for our WTO chess program in Mexico. And then to my left is Professor Wei Huan Zhou, who already introduced, who is Associate Professor and co-director of the China International Business and Economic Law Center at the Faculty of Law at the University of New South Wales in Australia. And then to my far left is Miss Elise Neller, who is an associate at the law firm Van Bale and Bellis, one of the leading law firms in our field. So without further ado, I will just delve straight into the issues because we got a lot of very interesting and difficult issues for our fourth panelist to tackle, and fortunately, it's not me who have to answer these difficult questions. So I feel rather relaxed now. So let me start with the first question. First, what are the major strategies and policy tools used to secure essential minerals supply chains in your jurisdiction? So I would like to start with Katrin, please.
Thank you so much, Henry. Wonderful to be here today. I'm not sure whether going first is a good thing or a bad thing in this case, but as Henry said, this is certainly complicated. I'm really coming to believe that this is one of the most important issues that we have to contend with at the moment. It crosses over everything. The future of the international trade system, climate change and environment, how we really implement sustainable development in practice, whether we learn from the past or make the same mistakes all over again. So I'm going to touch on a number of those things, but before I do that, I will answer the question that has been posed to me, which is what is happening in the United States? And where do we then the interesting parts I think will flow from that. Okay, so you all know, I think everyone knows, right, that the United States had this major piece of legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed just recently. So this just has gone into effect. There's still all of these questions about how this is going to play out. And there is still a raging debate in the US Congress and more broadly about elements of this act. So at the core of it are basically production subsidies, tax credits on electric vehicles. So this is the United States attempt to reduce carbon emissions, to go closer to net zero, at least to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030, which of course is ambitious, and the United States has been pushed very hard to move forward on something. So this is the attempt to do that. And also to spur investment in clean energy. However, there are other elements to this too. The United States really wants to encourage job creation and market development in the United States, reduce dependence on other countries for critical minerals. So this just takes on, I think, so many different dimensions. Now, because of the Inflation Reduction Act, the US is looking at different forms of trade mechanisms to try to kind of fit some of its partners under the provisions of the act. So basically this tax credit on electric vehicles has two components to it. One is the critical minerals component, the critical minerals requirements, which have a sourcing requirement and then a value added requirement. And the sourcing requirement is really, I think, kind of the key part and triggering all of these questions on trade, which mandates that a certain share, it's 40% now, it will go up, of critical minerals contained in the battery of a qualified vehicle must have been extracted or processed in the United States or a country with which the United States has a free trade agreement. Now that term free trade agreement is not defined in the legislation. And so the Treasury Department then has issued proposed regulations that list free trade agreement partners. And so there are other aspects of this too. I won't go into all of the details. There's also another component of this on battery component. There's this value added component to this. So there's a sourcing component and a value added component, right? But to meet the sourcing component, then it has to be United States or a country with which the United States has a free trade agreement. So in the US Treasury Department's proposed regulations, they list FTA partners, and most of them are countries with which the United States has what would be considered a free trade agreement under Article 24 of the GATT, right? A robust, multi-sectoral, multi-dimensional trade agreement. Mexico, Canada, of course, USMCA, Morocco, Nicaragua, Oman, Panama, Peru, Singapore, Colombia, the list goes on, Australia, right? So there are a whole list of all of these countries. It's not a very long list. The United States does not have that many free trade agreements compared to Europe, for example. Japan is also on this list, though. And the reason Japan is on this list now is that the United States has put in place this critical minerals agreement with Japan. The critical minerals agreement looks very different than a traditional free trade agreement. It is limited in scope to certain products. It does not cover substantially all the trade by a stretch of the definition on substantially all the trade. It also has some provisions on labor and environment, which is, of course, something that the US Congress considers very important. These are not particularly binding in this agreement's case. Now, this form of agreement is also under discussion with Europe and with the UK. And part of the debate right now in the United States is whether in subsequent iterations of this, those provisions should be strengthened, whether they should be more enforceable, they should be stronger provisions on environment and labor. And so that's part of the debate. And part of the debate is whether or not these kinds of agreements should be part of that list at all, whether they should be considered free trade agreements for purposes of this act and for purposes of this tax credit. So this is really sort of what's playing out in the United States. Let me just say a little, do I have one more minute to say a little bit more about so in this critical minerals agreement, and again, I think this is kind of we'll get to the more exciting parts of this, I think, to me, at least, like what does this all mean and what comes from this? But it has provisions on supply chain, of course, and then these environment and labor provisions. And as I said, the Japan agreement is a little bit softer on these. It has commitment to not restrict the import or export of critical minerals or impose export duties on critical minerals. And then it has things like standards domestic environmental protection regulations, responsible sourcing, assessing the environmental impact of critical minerals projects, promoting circular economy measures, and adopting, maintaining, and enforcing international labor rights standards. So similar to some of the language you see in other US mechanisms, but with much more of a focus here, of course, on the issue at hand. So I guess maybe I will stop with that. That is, I guess, in a nutshell, and that's a short nutshell, what is happening in the United States that is prompting some of this discussion. So I'm looking forward to the next part where I can really dig in on some of the implications of this, but I hope I answered the question.
Yes, indeed, Katrin, thank you so much for outlining for us in very clear language what are the current policies in the US, which is the biggest player in the world. And now, next, let's turn to Elisa, who will illuminate to us what is the policy in the EU, please.
Thank you, Henry, and good afternoon, everybody. It is really an honor for me to be presenting here today. And thank you, Katrin, for deliberating so thoroughly on the US's measures. So in terms of the EU, it really finds itself in a different position to the US as a net importer of almost 80% of its raw material needs. And it is strategically dependent on a few limited countries and for some raw materials on one single third country for its raw material needs. Now, at the same time, the EU has also committed itself to being net zero by 2050, the first continent to be net zero. And it really wants to develop its own industries around net zero technologies. So the demand for raw materials, which it does not have, is expected to increase dramatically over the next decades. So really, the interest of the EU in the critical raw material value chains is really to ensure supply and predictability for its companies undergoing the green transition, as well as diversifying supply chains in order to really de-risk from its dependencies. And this was really highlighted to the EU during the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine, where a lot of the problems with its dependencies were really coming to fruition for the EU. So in terms of the measures and policies it's been taking, as a resource seeker, it uses its trade and investment tools to really prevent resource-rich countries from adopting export restrictions or making in some way exports of raw materials more expensive for EU companies. And it's done this in a number of ways. So even though we have very limited rules regulating the supply side of trade in the WTO, it has used these rules before the dispute settlement body in mainly 3 cases. But it now finds itself in a really uncomfortable position where it's not able to enforce the panel's findings because of the lack of standing of the appellate body system. So the EU is also really trying to fill the gap left in WTO rules and really trying to push for new obligations in its trade partners. And it does this through accession protocols for countries wishing to accede to the WTO, as well as free trade agreements. And a lot of these agreements include prohibitions on, for example, export taxes. Now, while other countries in the world may have stopped with their free trade agreements and bilateral negotiations, the EU has continued on a very ambitious course. And it really has adopted recently a number of free trade agreements with resource-rich countries, particularly with Chile, Kazakhstan, Canada, and there are more in the pipeline with Australia and Indonesia, for example. And in these free trade agreements, there are really entire chapters on raw materials and also energy, which really aim to secure the EU's supply of these raw materials. And they're also reinforced through investment provisions, both in terms of giving market access to EU investors in mining industries abroad, but also these are then complemented with post-investment protections. The EU also uses its trade defense instruments to really target resource-rich countries that are exporting products to the EU, usually downstream products or added value products from raw materials, where the raw materials used to produce these products have been subject to export restrictions or government intervention on the domestic market. So we see higher anti-dumping and countervailing duties on these products. But all of these real measures are really targeted against export restrictions in its trading partners. But recently, the EU has really seen the value in cooperating with resource-rich countries, especially if it wants to ensure predictability of supply. And so it's been negotiating these raw material partnerships with a number of resource-rich countries. And these really aim to add value for both the EU, but also for these resource-rich countries. In exchange for raw materials, the EU will invest in processing and mining activities in the resource-rich country. And these are really funneled through the EU's fund, the Global Gateway Fund, which is the response to China's Belt and Road Initiative. So I guess overall, and to really wrap up, the EU is trying to have these win-win relationships in terms of raw material partnerships, but where cooperation falters, we're likely to see that the EU will continue to use its trade and investment tools, and particularly its defensive actions like trade defense and in international dispute settlements to really stop restrictive practices in its trading partners. That's me for now. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we understand the perspectives of the two big players, US and EU. Now let's turn to Latin America, where America will explain to us what is going on in that region.
Thank you, Henry. So I'll now take you from two big examples of countries that are extracting these minerals to the land of extraction, Latin America, and it's a region which is a major supplier in the supply chain of critical minerals, crucial for a number of critical minerals, including lithium, copper, nickel. So I'll try and sort of present my comments in three different segments here. I'll present to you some facts, some stats, some facts, some numbers, then the strategies, and finally the regulations. So stats on what this region holds in terms of critical minerals. First, Chile, Peru, and Mexico hold approximately 40% of world's copper reserves. Second, about 2/3 of global lithium reserves are in Latin American Golden Triangle, which is Bolivia, Argentina, and Chile. So there was this report which showed in 2022 and 2021, the so-called lithium triangle in the salt flats of these three countries accounted for 56% of world resources, 52% of world reserves, and 1/3 of world production in lithium in the last 2 years. And because these countries are massively rich in terms of resources they are holding, they are now exploring different ways to increase the economic benefits from the mining activity that they're receiving from all over the world. And that's where I move to the strategies. And there are two particularly interesting strategies that the countries in Latin American region are employing to gain the benefits, to reap the economic benefits. One is that instead of just exporting the raw materials, the minerals as the raw materials to developed countries, what Latin American countries are trying to do is that they are trying to add value to these raw materials that will ultimately generate higher export revenues and taxes, and also lead to positive economic development for them, creating new kinds of jobs in processing industries, as well as new skills for the workers. And the second interesting strategy that the Latin American countries are using on the region are that they're now considering the development of regional supply chains. In addition to the national initiatives on critical minerals mining, they're now working on building regional supply chains to develop their region's industrial capacity and not just their individual countries' capacity. And for that, they need regulations. And the regulatory framework in the region is quite similar. There are a number of overlaps, but there's an exception to that. And the exception comes from Mexico, and I'll come to that in a while. But generally, the regulatory frameworks in the region establish that the non-renewable natural resources in the subsoil, including minerals, belong to the state. And the central government is the administrative body, except Argentina, which has the delegation, which has the authority to delegate these powers to the provincial governments. Private investment is quite predominant in the mining sector in the region. And the existing norms on mining critical minerals are based on the model of granting concessions to private companies, which is then used for making decisions on investment, production, and destination of the extracted mineral. But there are different fiscal instruments that these countries in the region are using. So, for example, in Chile, the government at the moment is using income or profit tax, known as special mining tax, as a fiscal instrument. Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and Bolivia impose what they call as mining royalties. And these royalties are based on the volumes extracted or the value of sales of critical minerals. Colombia and Brazil has a different model. They are using auctions to award concessions and mineral exploration licenses to private companies for copper and other minerals. And this is very different from what they previously had, which was the first come, first serve approach. And now, even Peru, Chile, Colombia, and Brazil, they are now thinking of sort of modifying their regulatory modalities and making them more investor friendly, and to also help them reap better sort of benefits, economic benefits from what their region is producing. Mexico presents an exception here in this respect, because when we move to Mexico, the regulatory landscape is quite, it's based on resource nationalism, I would say, because since last year, in April 2022, Mexico approved a new legislation. And with this new legislation, there has been a complete ban on private lithium mining and processing activities, because these activities are now fully reserved for the state. And this is only going to become even more nationalist if the current political party, Morena, in Mexico continues and retains power beyond 2024, because our current president, AMLO, has clearly declared that if they retain the power, then the proposal is to amend the Constitution of Mexico and to enshrine in the very Constitution that lithium and other strategic resources of minerals are reserved solely to the government and no new concessions are to be permitted. Now, they changed the law last year, but there were many concessions from the previous decades and years that were carrying on in Mexico. So there's a lot of uncertainty among private investors as to which way they would go and whether the current government would honor the concessions that they were already working on in the mines to extract lithium and copper. And the current government has said that, yes, they would respect the existing concessions. However, in the law that was passed last year, there's a clause, a controversial clause that says that the government can go back on their decision at any time without giving any justification to the private companies. So the rule of law situation, the environment, the certainty revolving around the mining of minerals is getting quite tense and controversial in Mexico. So to respond to the question on regulation, we can clearly see that Mexico is going for extreme resource nationalism. But on the other hand, most of the other countries in the region are set to benefit from this race with their regulatory modalities based on public-private partnerships, public-private exchanges through auctions or royalties to grant concessions.
Thank you very much, Marita, for that perspective from resource-rich countries. Now we've heard what's going on in the US, in EU, and also in Latin America. Now let's turn to the elephant in the room, China.
It's very beneficial hearing from my colleagues talking about the strategies and policies from resource-seeking countries and resource-rich countries. And I think the two takeaways for me, before I talk about China, is that first, that there is the proliferation of critical mineral strategies and policies based on national interests. And secondly, that there are other regions and countries in the world that holds a predominant position in the supply chain. So I think we need to take that two accounts into consideration when we talk about China. Now, I also want to start with some data or facts, but not those ones that are already known in the world, but those ones that are often overlooked in discussions of this subject matter. And that is, China is not only a major supplier of critical minerals, but also a world's top importer of many minerals. One latest study by a group of Chinese experts reported that China's reliance on imports for critical minerals such as nickel, cobalt, chromium is around 90%. And on lithium is around 50%. These experts have also proposed to the government lists of 37 critical minerals to the, and reported that China faces or will face a shortage of supply in 22 of them. Even on rare earths, China's global supply fell below 50% in 2019. This is not to deny the fact that China remains a predominant player or supplier in the critical mineral supply chains, nor is it to deny that China had a first mover advantage through its strategies and industry policies in the mining and related sectors. Nevertheless, it is important to note that China faces similar supply chain challenges as other economies, including shortage of supply, price fluctuation, and also needs to take action to secure and diversify supply chains. Understanding China's domestic economic needs and policy priorities is key to understanding China's critical mineral strategies. Besides supply chain security, China's strategies have also similarly focused on addressing a range of long-standing or emerging challenges at home. This includes illegal mining, overexploitation, smuggling, environmental pollution, depletion of natural resources. These goals are most known from the two WTO disputes on China's export restraints on raw materials and rare earths. China lost the two disputes, removed the measures concerned, and used the WTO decisions to further promote domestic reforms, particularly in the rare earths sector. We have discussed China's critical mineral strategies in detail in an upcoming paper. We covered a period from 1970s until today. It's very hard to do a brief summary, but let me try. China did not have a critical mineral strategy until 1916. For decades since 1970s, China's strategies focused on the rare earths industry. It started by fostering the growth of the infant industry through supportive programs such as subsidies and export promotion. These policies led to a fast growth of the industry, but also caused a range of problems, as noted earlier, such as overexploitation, pollution, depletion of resources. To address these problems, China took a range of measures to balance the development of the industry and sustainability. When China released its first critical mineral strategies in 2016, this balanced approach remains at the core. Even though the objectives now have become more complex due to challenges in external markets, which cause supply chain risks. China's critical mineral strategy listed 24 what they call strategic minerals, including minerals essential for major grain technologies, such as lithium, copper, nickel, cobalt, graphite, zinc, and others. China's strategies have considered a range of objectives and policies. The inward-looking strategies include fostering mining activities, improving efficient use and reservation of minerals, upgrading industry structure, advancing innovation, and promoting a circular economy and green development of the industry. China actually treats the inward strategies as being fundamental to its minerals security. These are complemented by outward strategies, including inbound and outbound investment and trade, notably through free trade agreements and cooperative arrangements under the Belt and Road Initiative. But most of the time, it's the complementary strategies are highlighted in the public and policy debates, not China's internal policies that are used as the fundamental tools to address internal challenges. Now, I won't have time to elaborate, but let me just quickly say our observation after a detailed study of China's strategies since 1970s is that these strategies are not designed or intended to cause disruptions in global supply chains. China has consistently prioritized in domestic policy goals, seeking to find solutions to its internal challenges. Now, these challenges have important economic and strategic implications for China's trading partners and competitors, but they are approaches adopted to enhance China's global competitiveness and supply chain security, rather than pursue confrontation. As we have heard, and I think China's strategies are not fundamentally different from the strategies and policies being developed by other economies. All of these reflects the long-standing systemic challenge for the global trading system, which is that governments tend to prioritize domestic economic needs in policymaking, while paying insufficient attention to the global effect of these policies. China is certainly not unique in this regard.
Thank you, Wei Huan, for those remarks, which again remind us of the global implications of the domestic policies of WTO members. And actually, for those of you who are familiar with WTO jurisprudence, you know that, as Wei Huan mentioned earlier, it was the two China cases, the raw materials case and the rare earth case, which was litigated about 10 years ago, that first brought the concern over critical minerals into the review of the general public. So these strategies and policies that the four speakers have mentioned, each countries have different types of policies, and each have different considerations. But on the other hand, if you look at the global impact, you could argue that they would have a negative impact on global supply chains. Actually, this was mentioned by China, for example, in its a report called China's Proposal for the Reform and Development of a Global Governance, which the Chinese government just issued yesterday, where it noted the negative effect on global supply chains on many of these policies. So I was wondering if our fellow panelists can talk about how these policies would disrupt the global supply chains, and what are the effect on the tensions between governments, and also on how to achieve the goals such as climate adaptation and other sustainable development goals. So maybe let's start this time from my left, from Elise, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Henry. So I guess because I'm starting off, I think it's first important to set out that we need to look at reality of critical raw material value chains when we look at how they can affect supply chains, and how government actions can really cause tensions between other countries. The reality of critical raw material value chains is that demand is growing faster than supply. No one country in the world can fulfill all of their own raw material needs, and this is the case definitely with China. So that this necessitates trade, and that for every type of raw material, there are a few countries that control most of the supply and processing of those raw materials. It's not diversified. So what we really have is a web of interdependencies, so that when a country acts on a unilateral or even a bilateral basis, you're going to have a shift in supply chains, and you're going to have ramifications for the entire web. So I think with that being said, I will go into how the EU's actions can cause tensions with other governments and supply chain disruptions. There are mainly two ways. The first is when the EU works on a unilateral level. And I mentioned earlier that the EU uses its trade defense tools to really stop resource-rich countries from adopting export restrictions. by imposing higher anti-dumping and countervailing duties on downstream products where there's been restrictions on the domestic level. Now, whether or not these restrictions or government interventions in the raw material markets are WTO compliant or not, higher anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties imposed by the EU cause tensions with the country of export and also lead to higher prices for EU consumers. And a number of these products that are targeted by trade defense are used in net zero technologies. The second main way that the EU can cause tensions is particularly when it negotiates on a bilateral level. And that is either through its free trade agreements or more and more now these resource partnerships. We see tensions really on two levels. The first is when the EU starts negotiating with its trade partner, because the EU really enters into these negotiations with an extractivist agenda. It really aims to make the resource-rich country accept a whole number of far-reaching obligations that restrict their policy space to develop their industries and to add value around their raw materials. And this was notably the case with Chile and Kazakhstan, which eventually both agreed to the EU's demands, but were able to reach a number of carve-outs in order to retain some of their policy space. We also see tensions between resource-seeking countries themselves. And this is because a number of these free trade agreement obligations are not based on a most favored nation basis, MFN. So, for example, with export taxes, the EU only requires that there be no export taxes on exports of raw materials to the EU. But this means that the trade partner can continue to adopt and apply export taxes on exports to other third countries. Now, obviously, this aggrieves those third countries because it diverts supply away from them and towards the EU, leading them to pay more for their raw materials and to sometimes even have no access to supply at all. And this is really complemented as well through the investment protection provisions in the free trade agreements made by the EU, because the market access commitments to raw materials are really granted only to EU investors to the detriment of other third countries. And particularly the EU is really investing in processing activities in its third country trade partners. And while this has benefits in that third country, because it leads to, adding value around their raw materials and job creation, etc., really the goal of the EU is to make sure that the processing is not transferred to China, and this comes back into the diversifying of supply chain risks. So the consequences of all of these measures is really counterintuitive for the green transition and our environmental objectives. If you have fractures and uncertainties at the supply side of raw materials, you're going to have price and timing ramifications for downstream operations and for all countries in the web. And this really does and can slow down our net zero transition.
Thank you, Elise. So you mentioned that there's a different perspective from the resource extracting countries and the resource rich countries. Maybe I will turn to Amrita so that you can explain what is the perspective from the resource rich country.
Thanks, Henry. So my perspective on this is going to be very critical. So I would like to start with that warning, because I would like to comment on how this race to get their hands on critical minerals has led to, even though it's for the climate change and combating climate change, how it's led to a lot more destruction and violation of a number of sustainable development goals, including goal 3, 5, 6, 10, 13, 15, and the list goes on. But just for the sake of time, I would focus on 4 here. So my first point is on goal 3 and 6. Goal 3 being on good health and well-being, and goal 6 being on sustainable management of water for all. And as we know, the mining of critical minerals, especially lithium, has extremely high water requirements. And the problem is that the countries across this region are already facing very high degrees of water stress. So when I say water stress, it means that there are more water users which are competing for limited supplies, and climate change is intensifying that problem. And the water problem in the region, in Chile, in Amazonia, and others, is that the quantity as well as the quality of water is going down as a result of mining of critical minerals in the region. So when we only look at the region between 1990 and 2020, there's a report that says that 87% of disasters that occurred between these areas, these years in the region, were related to water paucity and climate change as a result of that. And in the region, 161 million people are without safely managed drinking water, and some other hundreds of millions of people without safely managed sanitation. The mining activities has also led to a number of natural disasters, water-related disasters in the region, including storms, floods, droughts that negatively affect the human settlement on this land. So this all goes to show how the mining of critical minerals is directly going against Sustainable Development Goal 6, which is the sustainable management of water. Where is that? There is no respect for that. And of course, right to good health and well-being is thrown out of the window here, because the regulatory approaches and the regulatory modalities sound good in different countries, but they are completely ignorant of the impact it is having on in this respect. My second point goes to Sustainable Development Goal 10, which is on reducing inequalities generally. And here I would like to bring your attention to the interest of indigenous communities. A study has found that more than half of the world's resource base for crucial energy transition materials is located on the land where indigenous people live. A whopping 85% of current and planned lithium extraction projects are located on or near land inhabited by indigenous people. And this is just an example to show the kind of intervention that this activity is having with the lives of these communities, because they have done untold damage to their lives in a number of ways. They have taken away the control of their lands from them at the cost of paying off the central government in most of these cases in Latin America. And in Amazon, for example, mining of critical minerals has caused massive destruction because it has contributed to large-scale deforestation, polluted local waters and food supplies. It has increased the conflict between indigenous populations and the prospectors and the military. There was a report by Global Witness that found last year in October that 3 people per week in Amazon are killed, and most of them are indigenous, and they are killed while protecting their lands from the mining activities of critical minerals. And mining of critical minerals was directly linked to most of the killings in the region of Amazon. So that's just one example to show the kind of impact that these activities are having on the lands of the indigenous communities. And then we are talking about reducing inequality, right? And my final point goes to Sustainable Development Goal 5, gender equality, equality between men and women. A lot has been done in this year's public forum, last year's public forum, Aid for Trade, and WTO is now focused on making trade work for women. But the fact is that mining of critical minerals is disempowering women because it jeopardizes their interest in a number of ways. I'll restrict here to 3 examples. One, mining or critical minerals extraction leads to labor exploitation, mainly in developing countries. And in these developing countries, women are a major source of comparative advantage. So what does that mean? That means that they are employed in these mines at very low wages and in very poor working conditions. That leads to, in heterodox economics term, feminization of labor, which is not empowering for women at all. My second example relates to natural disasters. We've already discussed how these activities have caused various natural disasters such as floods, heat waves, bushfires, and rise in sea levels. And number of studies have already shown how disasters and crises have an extremely disproportionate impact on women, because first, they are more vulnerable, and second, they have lesser access to resources to protect themselves financially as well as physically. And final example is upon the PPEs. We all know that mines are inherently dangerous workplaces, and to work there, workers require the use of personal protective equipment, which are designed as per a given standard. And these standards are made with complete disregard for a woman's or a woman's body's need. They are made as per the standard of a male's body. Therefore, these PPEs are much more unsafe for women than for men working in these mines. One example of PPEs is the one-piece onesie, the one-piece suit that is usually used across the world in mining industry. And these onesies are clearly made for men, because a female employee working in these mines would have to remove the entire gown to relieve herself number of times in a single day. And that clearly shows how the extent to which the standard of PPEs in mining industry have completely disregarded the physical needs of women. So I would just want to sort of conclude by saying that before big countries before big countries sort of venture out of their own jurisdictions to dig holes in the rest of the world, because they don't like digging holes in their own land, it is very important that they, as well as the receiving countries, as well as the host countries, consider their approach going forward in light of these challenges that sort of accompany the race to find the white gold.
Thank you, Amrita. So we heard the perspective from the extracting country, from the resource rich country. And I guess the US is a kind of combination of both, because just 3 days ago, there's news that actually people have discovered the largest lithium reserve in the US, in the state of Nevada, holding about 20 to 40 million metric tons. So I was wondering if Katrine, you can explain to us, what is the perspective of the US for all this?
Thank you so much, Henry. Well, I will try to explain the perspective of the US, but I'd also like to go to the question you had posed to us before too, about what challenges this raises. I'm finding it too hard to stay just in the US perspective for the discussion. I hope you'll permit me to move out of it just a bit to talk about where I think this raises fundamental challenges. But I promise I will go back. I will never leave a question of yours unanswered if I can avoid it. So I think there are three big sets of challenges that I see coming from all of this. And overarching all of that, I think, is the fact that we are dealing with this massive collective challenge globally. And yet these responses to it are completely zero sum. So I do not see how we are going to get to an approach that works on a collective challenge if we have only these very, very narrow zero sum approaches trying to get us there. So I'm going to focus on three things. One, I feel like I would be remiss at the WTO Public Forum if I did not talk about international trade law and the implications all of this has for international trade law. So I will speak to that. I also want to talk, though, about sustainable development. I'm glad that Amrita has taken us through the sustainable development goals. I'm going to do it a little bit differently and talk about how sustainable development is defined as a concept legally and what implications that has here. And then I want to talk a little bit about history, because I feel like we are completely avoiding every lesson that we should have learned from the last century. So I want to talk a little bit about that and what I feel like that means for the world. So I hope that's okay, Henry, if I do those three things. So on the legal side, obviously, there are some big challenges to these zero-sum approaches. Article 1 MFN, I think, has already come up, right? Treating certain WTO members differently than other WTO members, fundamental MFN challenge. Article 3, national treatment. Again, treating, for on the electric vehicles, for example, treating foreign differently than domestic, challenge under Article 3. I mean, I think that we can look at all of this. It's very difficult to say on its face that these measures seem to be consistent with some of these fundamental principles. The subsidies and countervailing measures agreement. I mean, I think the United States approach has elements of it, local content, for example, that for years have been a big part of the debate as being completely counter to the subsidies and countervailing measures approach. And yet here we are with these measures that have that embedded in them. And then, of course, there might be defenses against all of this, right? Article 20 clearly has provisions in it that would go to some of these environmental concerns that we're talking about, but Article 20 has a chapeau that must be met. And would, these measures be consistent with the chapeau? Arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination, disguised restriction on international trade. I mean, I think it would be very difficult to argue some of this. Article 21 on national security, and I want to give a shout out to one of my former students who's here, Emily Kirstens, who wrote this great piece about this in a book that we launched yesterday on using trade tools to fight climate change, looking at whether Article 21 on national security could be used in this context of climate and some of the problems inherent in that. So I don't think that there is sort of a clear case for how you can make a legal argument that these measures will sustain. Now, of course, we're in a situation of uncertainty legally too, which I think is going to be part of the challenge that we face here. So that's kind of the legal side of it all. I think it's something that we all have to keep in mind. And are we comfortable with these big deviations from these kind of fundamental principles that we have spent years debating and deliberating and refining? That's the first part. The second part, I think, is that there is sustainable development as a concept is also embedded in the WTO rules. It is part of the preamble to the Marrakesh Agreement establishing the WTO, the reference to sustainable development. Now, sustainable development is a term I feel like it's used a lot. I have a paper that I am finishing up on this, and it's going to be part of another book that contains papers from students from Georgetown Law School on what they think about sustainable development. But when I look at sustainable development, it's very clear. There are three components to it. It is not just the environmental component, which is part, but it is also an economic component and a social component. And then it has equity built into it. Equity for now, balance between countries, and equity for the future. I think it's very difficult to look at some of this and think, okay, if we are just purely focused on national interests, how are we meeting those equity requirements? I think that would be very, very difficult to make a case and say, this should just be for the United States taking care of itself, and the rest of the world is going to have to just cope. I think that would be a very difficult equity argument to make. I think it's also true, in my view, that there is an imbalance between these different components. And even then, if we're taking measures on the environmental side that are done, let's say they're, for very laudable reasons to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and, move toward net zero, even though I think the United States is less ambitious on that than Europe. How, we're still making all of these trade-offs. We are still making trade-offs on how that's going to happen, whether or not this is the right way to go about doing it, whether or not there are not, Amrita talked about the implications for indigenous communities. There's a lot packed into all of this that I think that we haven't really thought through. I mentioned history. So I teach a course on law and development. And one of the things that I do in my course is I show my students a map of Africa. This is a map of the transport and road infrastructure that has been built in Africa. If you've seen this map, 15 years ago or so, I started working on trade corridors. I thought this is fascinating. In trade, I'm a lawyer. Obviously, we talk so much about rules. The physical market of all of this really matters too. If you look at that map of Africa, and how the roads were built, where they are, where the railways are, there is this giant gap in the middle. Everything goes out. Everything goes out. And when I look at that, it makes me completely upset. It means that as a global community, the infrastructure choices that were made were to move the raw materials out of the continent, not to focus on connecting countries, not to focus on connecting economies, not to focus on building all of that value addition that we're talking about here. I feel like we're doing this all over again. We are going to repeat this awful history that we have said we would not want to do, right? Here we go again, trying to just get everything out. Europe putting higher anti-dumping duties on, anything that has been processed. These questions coming up around whose investment should it be? Should there be domestic investment? Should it only be foreign investment? Countries, I think it's not surprising then to see countries pushing back and saying, well, we're going to start restricting, which again, going to my initial point of we have this massive common challenge, and then every country is kind of fending for itself. So we have all of these countries putting in place export restrictions because they feel like they cannot protect their interests. Where do we wind up then as a global community? I wish I had a picture of this map to show you, but I feel like if we were to map this, if we were to map what's happening on critical minerals, it would really raise some difficult and important questions about what the world is heading towards. Where are we going with all of this? And how could that future possibly be sustainable and secure for anyone? It is just going to exacerbate some of these other challenges, human rights abuses, labor abuses, environmental challenges, because we are not approaching it in a way that's going to lead us to some kind of common ground. So I will stop with that, but just wanted to, I might not have answered your question. I apologize for that. I'll come back around on it. But I wanted to get these points out that, again, there's this legal dimension, a sustainable development dimension, which is quite broad, and a historical dimension. And the last thing that I'll say, if you'll let me, Henry, just to give a shout out to another one of my students, to a recent graduate, Luke Rowe, who was working with me as a research assistant right now and who was helping on this. He looked at a paper that I had done in 2012 on corridors, on these trade corridors in Africa, where I had said that the way that this has been done completely undermines accomplishment of the Sustainable Development Goals. I was so proud of myself for writing this in 2012 and glad that he's the one who found it in the paper that I had forgotten that I said. But again, I think going to Amrita's point, we are doing this in a way that is going to undermine the Sustainable Development Goals, which is, I think, part of what we're all here this week to try to figure out. So I will stop with that.
Thank you, Katrin. Wei Huan, please.
Thanks, Henry. Katrin, I think you are actually answering a question, but in an indirect way, which is basically showing all of the proliferation of the trade policies and instruments that are actually not compliant with the WTO rules, potentially at least, and questionable, I think. But everyone is doing the same kind of begatha labor, and also just for its own national interest. And in the interest of time, let me just talk about two things about China and then come back to the question about how this may actually cause disruptions. There are two major concerns about China. If you read the recent joint statement by the G7 governments, you will see that the de-risking strategy is based on two concerns about China. The first is China's dominance in the critical mineral supply chains, which I have talked about. So I will just leave that question as it is and some answers in the previous question for you to think about it. The second is economic origin. Now, this is more a political question than a legal question. In other ways, it's called the weaponization of the dominance China holds in this space. Now, I also want to give a warning that this can be a very controversial, so I will just say some of my observations about this question. I would say that in most circumstances, China remains in a defensive or responsive position. This was the case between the US-China trade war and the subsequent development of a range of laws by the Chinese government, such as unreliable entity lists, export control law, anti-foreign sanctions law, which were essentially designed to respond to US actions. Around the same time, China also has expanded its national security laws to allow consideration of economic and development interests as security interests. Now, again, this is also consistent with the expansive use of national security worldwide. When it comes to critical minerals, recent empirical studies, I think done by Professor Simon Evanet and also his team, surprisingly show that China's export restrictions on rare earths in 2010, which has been widely cited as a typical example of weaponization, actually did not target any specific country. And that's an empirical study that just came out recently. Now, more recently, in response to US restrictions on chips export to China, China curbed the exportation of two critical minerals. China's action was arguably not intended to cause immediate major economic impacts, as many reported, but it shows that China is likely to take more meaningful retaliatory actions if the US sanctions continue to escalate. Such retaliatory actions can also be a source of supply chain disruptions. Now, if we consider the growing de-risking, decoupling strategies, and the increasing, as my fellow panelists said, the increasing export restrictions and other nationalism measures used by resource-rich economies to protect their own resources and capabilities, China's actions, I would argue, are at best as disruptive as these actions. When it comes to economic coercion, it is important, I think, to note that China is not, it is not in China's interests to resort to coercive measures, especially given the external environment and China's need to build its reputation and partnerships. Therefore, I would argue it's likely that China would strictly confine any coercive actions to very limited circumstances going forward, particularly on matters that are most sensitive in China's political system or most disruptive, if you like, to China's political stability. This means China would not weaponize trade or disrupt supply chains as often and widely as is widely perceived. Rather, I would argue it is reasonable to observe that China will seriously weigh the benefits and costs of economic coercion and become increasingly cautious so as to minimize the negative impact on its global reputation and engagement. So I'll just touch upon that issue.
Thank you very much, Wei Huan. Now, I have one last question, but in the interest of time, because we only have like 12 minutes left, I would ask my fellow panelists to please be very brief in your answers to the last question. Please limit it to 1 minute. The last question is, we discuss all these challenges. So how should we solve all these challenges? Could the WTO play a role?
So I don't have a perfect answer to this. I think it is, again, going to be difficult. I have three things to highlight, though. One is collective approaches. I think we need to have, and the WTO clearly could play a role there. It is the mission of the WTO, right, to find collective approaches. I've heard discussion on this of maybe doing some kind of joint statement initiative, but I know that's also brings with it some questions on how to balance with special and differential treatment and the Doha round. Something collective, though. I've also heard of going back to CPTPP. Maybe we go back to these larger models. Balanced. I think whatever approaches they are, they have to be balanced. Again, right now, everything seems very lopsided, very zero sum. So if the United States, for example, were to expand the group of countries it's working with, if they were to work with Africa, they would have to do it, I think, though, in a different way that is much more balanced than some of these approaches right now. And the final point is, I think, inclusive. We talk so much about inclusive trade, and here we're talking about this issue that has massive implications for communities, for individuals, and we're not really talking about how to bring them into the discussion. So I think that has to be the third part of some kind of an approach going forward.
Thank you. Marita?
Thank you. I think the approach going forward to deal with this challenge, because I think so far the discussion has been focused on critical minerals extraction as if it's a debate about, or it's a discussion about two things, economics and going green. But that's not the case. There are a number of other concerns which are at play. And whenever we are in a situation where there are a number of concerns at play and the interest is global, because climate is not national, it's global, it's international, multilateral organizations always have a crucial sort of role to play in that respect. And we've already seen in very recent years how multilaterally negotiated outcomes could lead to solutions or provide us policy solutions which can help us harmonize or balance different conflicting, contradictory concerns that we have. And in this case, because we have that, and in fact, some countries have recently gone to the extent of calling this a new kind of imperialism. So if we have so many different sort of stakeholders looking at it in different ways, then I think we need to look multilaterally and find multilateral solutions, really. One example, recent example of how in climate change area, we found a multilateral policy solution where different interests were completely clashing against each other is a fisheries agreement. And the other is the Escazú agreement, which in 2018 was signed between 25 countries on providing right of access to environmental information, public participation in environment decision-making, and access to justice in environmental matters. So I think there's a board of options that we can look at even at the multilateral level, because we can go from soft law, including declarations and policy guidelines for respective policymakers in this country, is to hard law, which is negotiated outcomes. And of course, the potential of plurilaterals or GSIs is something that we can certainly consider in this respect.
Thanks. Wei Huan?
I also make 3 quick points. The first is that I think WTO remains the preferred forum for deliberate on supply chain issues. And the reason is very simple. It's the only forum that involves the United States and China. And also, there was a recognition at the time of China's accession, WTO accession, that this institution would not be truly global without China. And I think the same can be said to the global supply chains. And the second point I want to mention is that I can't say why the IPEF supply chain agreement, which was recently released, many of the components in that agreement can't be deliberated or discussed at the multilateral level. And the countries in IPEF would be much better off by involving China in these discussions, because it involves questions about regulatory cooperation, transparency, non-market policies, labor standards, and so on. And you would have be more effective in addressing these issues with China included. And the final point, and which is also a very important point, is that I think one important lesson that the pandemic has taught us is that one must not wait until a crisis to take action. So it's the time for action.
Thank you. Elise?
Yes, thank you. I agree with everything that's been stated by the other panelists, and I think we're in agreement that multilateralism is the way forward, because we have global challenges, we have global value chains. You cannot do this through unilateral or even bilateral measures. So I'll make 3 points as well, that's really very similar to the others. But I think the first point is that we really need to reform the appellate body system here. We have rules, very limited ones at that, regulating supply side of trade, but they're meaningless if they cannot be enforced. But I think second point, and perhaps it kind of is a transition towards some of the solutions that the other panelists have made, is the WTO could be a perfect forum for just starting discussions between countries. So we have lack of transparency on what governments are doing. We have a lack of transparency on the raw material needs and objectives, as well as these standards. And countries should be able to come together and address their concerns, ask questions with other nations, and really express their needs and interests. And perhaps these discussions could really lead to developing new rules at the multilateral level. And we do see compromise with resource-rich and resource-seeking countries, for example, through free trade agreements, where, particularly with the EU, where resource-rich countries do retain their policy space and agree on a certain minimum standards at the same time with the EU. So I think there is room for cooperation. It's just a matter of starting the momentum and getting the political discussions on board.
Thank you. Thanks for the 4 excellent panelists. So now we still have a bit of time left for a Q&A. So maybe I guess we will use about 10 minutes for the question. So I'd like to collect questions from the floor, and may I remind you to please first identify yourself, and second, identify which specific panelists you would like to answer your question, and third, please limit your questions to real questions, not long comments. Thank you. So first, I see a hand from Professor Ji Wenhua from China.
Thank you very much, Henry, for giving me the floor. I will keep my question very brief. And first, thanks to all the panelists that give very important information. But I think you are not a official representative, so feel free to share our thoughts. We don't take it as a official one. But my question is a little bit related with Henry's question. Okay, what's the role WTO could do? But today, I think we missed the part of the, we didn't hear a voice from a particular group. The countries which do not have resources, do not have extracting capacities, but they need those criminal products, such as Singapore, something like that. What's their role? Because they represent the vast majority of the WTO members. And I think, well, the WTO and the WTO rules will be a safeguard to them. But it seems that as analyzed by Catherine, the current WTO rules may not enough to prevent or safeguard the system. So I think to some extent, new rules should be discussed. Indeed, yesterday I asked Alan Wolf a question because he proposed that, okay, any country, if you would like to impose export control or indeed export restriction, you cannot restrict the export to 0. You must keep an equitable share for other countries, which means, okay, you have the right, I give you the right to realize your domestic policies, industry policy, environment policy, but in the meanwhile, you cannot, you must keep a share, because such kind of new ideas we cannot find in the current rules. So this is one area we could discuss, and all the other members could discuss. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Second, the lady. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Rahmi Hertanti from Indonesia. Just try to also referring the panels speaking about, I think in general, we can say that actually now every nation have the same narrative in the context of industrial policies, added values, etc. But in the context of developing countries, for example, I guess the policies that have been implementing by several developing countries, it's always under the or always become as a responder from the policy or development plans from the developed countries. So I just want to say that, for example, like in Southeast Asian countries, actually, if you see in the region, they are really pushing by different interests and different big power countries. We have RCEP. We have now negotiating the US IPEF, including how the EU want to also conclude several free trade agreements with ASEAN countries. That's always driven by their interests. But when ASEAN comes with an idea, for example, the Indo-Pacific framework in the Asian countries, for example, or even the idea to have a regional production hub on EV in this region. I mean, that should be come as an idea of development come from the global South. I mean, if we want to put the idea of development, it shouldn't be come from the developed countries. And I just want to know the panelists, because the 3 regions have big interest in these regions, in Southeast Asian countries. And what do you think the idea of the development agenda that has been pushing by this region, especially in the context of the development of regional production hub of EV? That's the first thing. And the second, actually, I just want to also highlight, if we
I'm
can
sorry,
also, just one point, if we can also push the cooperation driven by the Global South agenda, it means that we have also put all development agenda discussions in the WTO based on the driven of Global South ideas. So it means the Doha development agenda should be as a priority in the discussions at the WTO. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, Teresa.
Thank you, Henry, for giving me the floor. Teresa Carpenter, I'm a trade expert currently working with the United Nations. All of the panelists spoke about multilateral institutions and their convening power. What do you think could be the role of the United Nations, particularly UNCTAD, in this area to find solutions that are development friendly and in the global interest? Thank you.
All right, one last question. Yes.
You mentioned that the United States is seeking new partnership engagement with development of mineral resource in African countries. I totally agree with you. And I also remember that last year, the Biden's administrative government write separately two agreement with Republic of Congo and Zambia for developing the mineral resource. So my question is, how the United States government makes the balance to encourage U.S. joint companies to explore in the development or investment in Africa and the human rights protections in Africa, or enhance the welfare of the people in Africa, not only focus on the mineral resource in Africa countries. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've collected 4 questions. Now may I suggest to my fellow panelists, each of you to please pick one question to address, and please try to do it in like 1 minute. Yeah, let's start with Katrin.
It's a difficult task here. Okay, I'm going to try to follow that, but I think I can combine on 2 of them, because I think part of the answer to what you have just asked about, which was directed at me, how do you do this in a more balanced way? And I was saying, I think the United States government should focus more on Africa, given, I think, the history, given all of the rich resources in Africa, but do it in a completely different way. Now, that's going to be challenging to figure out. I think your point, though, is part of the answer. We need to look to African partners to figure out how to do this in a more balanced way. So I definitely think that these proposals that are put on the table by developing economies should get much more weight. So I advocate for a bottom-up approach, for a more, and I think this is a perfect example of that. We cannot do this the usual way, where it's kind of pushed down from these larger economies. It has to be a totally different approach. And I think we should have collective approaches on export restrictions. I'm sorry, I snuck that in.
I would like to take on the rest question on the role of UNCTAD. Really interesting question. I think UNCTAD can have a role in different dimensions. One is definitely research. The Trade and Development Division at UNCTAD has done some phenomenal research in different sustainable development and trade areas. In fact, the division was one of the first voices to start researching trade and gender, trade and labor, and some other issues. So there's so much scope for research on how these sort of issues, concerns relate to intersect with sustainable development goals, as well as the other question that I would like to merge with as where is the Global South perspective? So how do we add the Global South perspective to strike a balance and to ensure that, you know, we're not turning this into a new kind of imperialist debate is important. Second way in which UNCTAD could contribute is by working on and issuing policy recommendations to policymakers to work on this area in Global South as well as Global North, having different perspectives. And finally, capacity building. I think UNCTAD has some phenomenal courses on trade and sustainable development, and more particularly on different areas of inclusive trade, trade and gender. And these courses have a wealth of numbers of years and alumni base. So using on this experience of designing capacity building courses for government officials. Going forward, UNCTAD could probably think of delivering a course on how do we go about, or how global South countries can go about negotiating critical minerals agreements, because there's a lot of expertise, again, capacity in developed world, but we may not have the same case in the global South. So just capacity building and expertise based courses by UNCTAD could be the other way to go.
Let me just pick up several questions and just answer in one go. I think what we're dealing with is an area in which we're very unfamiliar with, and particularly in this institution. So we shouldn't preclude any discussions at this stage. But at some stage, when we have increasing understanding of these issues, we should start thinking about the boundary that this institution could actually deal with. So there may be, and I think there will be, increasing demand for cross-institution coordination in this regard. So what should be dealt with and can be best dealt with in the WTO, or what should be dealt with and can be best dealt with in other institutions? Because you're dealing with not only the traditional WTO rules and exceptions, we're seeing the increasing number of policies-based needs, right? Different kind of objectives now on the agenda. We're also seeing different kinds of approaches. If you read the IPEF supply chain agreements, including how you detect supply chain disruptions and risks, how you establish emergency responses networks, and how countries should actually coordinate in dealing with crisis. So all of these issues, and also how you deal with, how you engage more with the private entities, right? Not all of these issues can be sufficiently dealt with by the WTO itself. So there will be needs for coordination, and at some stage there needs to be a clear division of labor between the institutions.
Thank you. I will mainly pick up on the two questions raised here about the inclusiveness of developing countries, as well as those countries that do not have economic power to demand certain obligations from their trading partners and get caught really in the crosshair between the major powers in the world. And I think to touch on what you were saying is that the WTO should really do what it does best, and that is to facilitate dialogue. Countries are not talking. We are not discussing all of these issues, and that needs to definitely start. And I think the WTO would be a perfect forum for that. Whether or not the WTO is really the perfect forum to discuss standards on, for instance, mining and labor issues and environmental ways of extracting raw materials, perhaps the WTO is not the best place to do that, but I think starting a dialogue is the first step that needs to take place. And then we can define, like you said, the boundaries of this institution, and hopefully we can address some of the challenges that we're facing on a global level.
Thank you. When we started the panel, I said we are dealing with a very difficult question, but I think you would all agree with me that our fellow panelists have done a great job of trying to provide some of the answers to these questions. And even though we might not have all the answers, at least we hope that we provide you with some food for thought, which will help you to think about these issues. So I will have to conclude this panel now, but before we go, let's thank my dear fellow panelists again for their excellent contribution. Thank you so much for coming.